So what have the Ukrainians done? They've effectively allowed the front line to freeze, and they're hollowing the Russians out from behind with what I've described before in this program as SOE-type tactics. General Bodanov, the head of the GUR or HUR, as they're called as well, the head of the military intelligence, is carrying out attacks on Russian oil refineries on logistic basis and command and control. He's been behind the sinking of almost 50% of the Black Sea Fleet. Air defense sites are being attacked. Russian airfields are being attacked, and everything else. That's hollowing them out. So when the Ukrainians are ready to punch through, hopefully those defenses are going to be an awful lot weaker, because what's behind them, there's little substance.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we have lots to discuss. We're going to talk about the latest on the war in Ukraine, also the threat of a Russian sabotage campaign in Europe, and Chinese cyber attacks on the British Ministry of Defence. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, a former military intelligence officer with more than 26 years of experience in the UK Armed Forces and a former NATO planner. He's now a military analyst and respected commentator. Philip, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be back on Frontline again, James.
Let's begin with the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Are you expecting Russia to launch a fresh ground offensive at some point during May?
I think so. I think Russia has got a very small window of opportunity. They have got, on the front line, from a one-dimensional perspective, they've got the initiative at the moment. They're moving forward very slowly in certain areas. That's partially because what Ukraine is doing is they're trading space for time. So they're holding the Russians up for as long as they can. But as soon as they recognize that it's hopeless and they're going to lose too much equipment and too many people, they then withdraw back a little bit more. But every time they go back, their defenses aren't quite as good. So the Russians have got the potential to move forward elsewhere. And the Russians, there's some indications to suggest that they're planning a bigger attack in through the northeast. And why are they doing this at the moment? They know that the US aid has been unlocked, that's $61 billion. They know that there's more aid's been unlocked from Europe, but they also know that it's slow in coming in because the Western defense industrial bases don't quite have the capacity to feed in the huge numbers of pieces of ammunition and the equipment that is coming. So they see this as a small window of opportunity. And Putin, of course, today is his inauguration day. He wants to try and show some form of success to the people and say, look at how good I am. I'm dealing with Ukraine, but more appropriately, he'll say, I'm pushing the West back.
And how well prepared is Ukraine to resist any potential Russian offensive, given the full effect of the US aid hasn't been felt yet?
Ukraine's as prepared as it can be with a lack of ammunition, and in particular artillery ammunition and rocket ammunition. It's more vulnerable, as we've seen, to attacks from the air. It's more vulnerable on the front line because it doesn't have the indirect fire capability with the HIMARS rockets and with artillery ammunition to deal with the groupings of Russian forces as they prepare to come in. But it's still killing between 900 and 1,000 Russian soldiers a day. 20 to 40 pieces of Russian equipment today. 10 to 20 tanks a day are being destroyed. That's significant. Russia is using meat grinder tactics to just punch up against the Ukrainians, and almost whenever you're getting into that point where they don't care about the casualties, no matter how much ammunition you've got, they're just going to push through at some stage. Ukraine hasn't quite got the engineering assets to be able to deliver different layers of defensive positions to fall back on slowly whilst they're waiting for this ammunition and the rest of the military material to come forward.
You mentioned, Philip, Russia's meat grinder tactics, and obviously you need fresh troops to feed into the meat grinder, as it were. Are you expecting to hear more potentially from Putin after his inauguration today about a fresh wave of Russian mobilization?
Yeah, I think he'll do everything he can to try and mobilize by stealth. So he'll find different ways of finding more people to come through. But as it gets worse, and it will get worse for him, he's going to have to come into more public mobilization. And we're beginning to see the rhetoric behind that. It's been building up for quite some time. Describing this conflict as not being a conflict against Ukraine. It's a conflict against the West. He's trying to defeat NATO. It's NATO that's attacking Russia. Russia is under threat. And even with this speech that he gave today at the end of his inauguration, he was talking about Russia's collective response and collective responsibility to deal with the threat. So he's building it up in people's minds that this is bigger than the issue that he started, and he's blaming everyone else for it.
I want to get your thoughts, Philip, on something we discussed on yesterday's episode of Frontline. I was joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, and he was saying that he thinks it is feasible for Ukraine to launch a new counteroffensive against Russia in 2024, and he said there would be significant advantages to having one sooner rather than later, to launch one potentially in the autumn of 2024 as opposed to in 2025. Do you agree?
I do and I don't. I think Ukraine needs to make sure that they are ready to launch the counteroffensive. And what's made the counteroffensive that they launched last year not work? They didn't own the air. So, they couldn't create areas of air superiority for the ground forces then to fight through in. They didn't have the engineering assets to deal with the massively complex defenses that Russia had built around the Suvorikhin lines that are there. They didn't have the ammunition stocks and the numbers of troops ready to properly exploit that. So what have the Ukrainians done? They've effectively allowed the front line to freeze, and they're hollowing the Russians out from behind with what I've described before in this program as SOE-type tactics. General Bodanov, the head of the GUR or HUR, as they're called as well, the head of the military intelligence, is carrying out attacks on Russian oil refineries on logistic bases and command and control. He's been behind the sinking of almost 50% of the Black Sea Fleet. Air defense sites are being attacked. Russian airfields are being attacked, and everything else. That's hollowing them out. So when the Ukrainians are ready to punch through, hopefully those defenses are going to be an awful lot weaker, because what's behind them, there's little substance. But he needs to get the Western aircraft in. The pilots need to have the ammunition. They need to have the experience in the aircraft to be able to provide that local air defense or air superiority bubble around any ground offensive that's in. And then there needs to be the all-armed fight. And we haven't seen the Ukrainians use their armored forces in a mass way yet. That's how we'd see them used from a Western perspective. We see a brigade or a division level attack. We're seeing the Ukrainians using the tanks in ones or twos, and we're seeing the casualties coming through in ones or twos. That's the old Soviet style tactics that the Russians are using. And there's a lot more to go. So they could potentially go this year. The autumn's not the best time because the ground gets too soft for Western tanks and Western armored vehicles. But I think it's probably more likely and possibly better for them if they can continue this hollowing out late spring, early summer 2025.
You mentioned, Philip, Vladimir Putin and his increasing rhetoric of a war not just with Ukraine, but against the West. And I wonder if that feeds into the fact that we've now got European intelligence agencies warning that Russia is planning, and I quote, violent acts of sabotage across Europe as part of a more aggressive and concerted effort against the West. What form do you think those attacks would take?
Oh, that's the $6 million question. Russia has attacked the West. It's attacked the UK. It's attacked the UK with weapons of mass effect. You look at the poisoning of Litvinenko with polonium-210. If you look at the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, his daughter Yulia, in Salisbury with Novichok, its first use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK or the streets of Europe, or the first one that we'd discovered at that stage. Looking back, it seems the Russians have been using it beforehand, and we're getting stories coming through of companies that are linked to Ukraine, their warehouses and other things mysteriously catching fire in London. Now, the Russians have got the ability through their organizations associated with their military intelligence, the GRU, to put saboteurs in different places. Whether those saboteurs are going to carry out more Novichok-type poisonings, or whether mysterious fires are going to come out, or whether it's going to be something more serious and we see a growth in terrorism, that's a possibility. a greater possibility and probability is what we're going to see is Russia trying to stimulate other groupings that are operating across Europe and in the UK to carry out more violent acts. So, potentially ISIS or Al Qaeda, Islamist-related terror organizations suddenly find that they're getting training and help and sponsorship and access to weapons and explosives from a source that they don't know. That source would likely be Wagner, which is linked to the GRU. And of course, they're operating throughout Africa, so I've got the links into the command and control that there is in these terror organizations. And we are already saying what Russia's doing in the information domain. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the information domain to create protests, to create disruption and all the rest of it across the country. We're seeing the protests in support of the Palestinians causing disruptions in many countries across the world and causing real political dilemmas. Russia will be behind a lot of that. That's something that people don't realize. They'll be funding a lot of what's going on and helping to stimulate it because they can see a fracture, they can see political influence, and they'll put the proverbial knife in and wiggle it to see how far it goes. So I think we're already being attacked.
It's interesting you mentioned that example of the business in London that its warehouse was attacked. I think it was a Ukrainian-owned parcel delivery business. There was also a depot in Spain, I think, that was targeted, and it was Ukrainian owned, and previously they'd helped with the transportation of humanitarian aid to Lviv at the very outbreak of the war. So interesting that was targeted, but also interesting that reportedly the person, one of the people involved, was recruited by Wagner. Do Wagner still have much of a role these days?
Wagner have got a huge role. And there were a couple of people that have been arrested for that arson attack, have been arrested under the new secrecy laws that there are in the UK. So that points to something really quite interesting. Now, Wagner never really went away. They moved when Prigozhin's coup, if it was a coup, failed. They moved more into Africa. They've been underpinning a lot of the oligarchs' business interests, collective oligarchs' business interests in Africa with mines, with wood, with propping up governments and other natural resources that are around. And that's where the real influence is. And Moscow has taken more central control of Wagner. It was set up as a private army to do the dirty work on behalf of Putin in different places across the world before Ukraine had happened. The first bit of dirty work they did was get involved in the capture of Crimea in 2014. But their power has been used elsewhere. Putin has wrestled them back into more central control after what Prigozhin had done. Prigozhin, was it an attempted coup? It was probably more him protesting the fact that the relationship that he had with the defense minister wasn't right and ammunition was being withheld. This is a spat between oligarchs that is being played out in the military activity that's going on, and it's criminal fighting criminal. And of course, the criminal in chief is the head oligarch, and the head oligarch in Moscow, in Russia, is Vladimir Putin himself.
So if we're going to see an increasing number of these acts of sabotage against Western nations, what should the appropriate response be from the West, Philip?
Well, we can send another stiff letter to the United Nations or get our ambassador to deliver one to the Kremlin in Moscow. It's very difficult to attribute it. And I think what we'll find is that our intelligence services, who are very good indeed, these sorts of attacks will be in the same sort of guise as terrorist attacks and other bits and pieces potentially. We have, since the horrible attacks in 2017, our intelligence services in the UK have stopped almost 40 late-stage attacks because they've got their finger on the pulse. And we'll find that our intelligence services are redoubling their effort to look at this as a potential new threat and deal with it from that perspective. So I think we should have confidence that the majority of it, there will be a handle on it. It's just worrying that if the Russians are doing it and they put a lot of resources behind it, they only need to be successful once or twice, whereas our intelligence services need to be successful all of the time to stop this. But it's a worrying development. We just have to monitor it closely.
And just finally, on Russia and the way it may attack the West, you mentioned its use of nerve agents in the past with Litvinenko and the Skripals. Do you think Putin would use a nerve agent now? Do you think he'd do that again in the UK or in a Western country?
I don't think he cares. Yeah, of course, he'd do it if he can assassinate, because he used Novichok because it was very clear to those that he was sending a message to that this had come from Russia and come from the state. When it got identified, but he chose Salisbury because it gave him plausible deniability. We heard the statements coming out saying, no, it wasn't us. It must have escaped from the British chemical defence establishment at Porton Down. And then we saw the leader of the opposition stand up in Parliament and turn around and ask how we could prove that wasn't the case. Putin had created that masking, that maskirovka, which is their doctrine, and therefore, by the time he's done that, the political impetus, the impetus across the media and all the rest of it had dissipated the impact of going, no, we've got you banged to rights, we're going to deal with you now, because it caused all of this discussion that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. That's what he'll do again. It's within his tactics. He will very carefully do things below the threshold, is how we describe it. So whether it's the use of Novichok, whether it's the use of radiological substances, whether it's some other form of poison, whether it's arson, whether it's cyber attacks or anything else, we will see that. What we're definitely seeing this year is an increase in the information domain, and misinformation, or more appropriately disinformation deliberately targeted to cause disruption, will be very, very big because of the number of elections that we have across not just Europe but across the globe.
Talking of cyber attacks, that brings us on to one of the big stories of today, which is this suspected Chinese cyber attack against the British military. We believe that they've been able to access the names and bank details, and in some cases, potentially even home addresses of British soldiers. How significant a breach of UK cybersecurity is this, Philip?
It's a very serious breach. It's what is referred to as a supply chain breach. So it wasn't a breach of Ministry of Defence computers. They subcontract the payroll process out to a third party, and I understand it's that payroll process that has been compromised. Now, if the only bit that's been compromised is an amount of money being transferred to a bank account and people's personally identifiable data around that's serious enough. But it's not going to have a massive implication on the operational capability of the military or the security aspects around different service personnel or veterans. If it's more detail, however, where the pay statements are compromised as well, then that would give hostile intelligence service access to know who's getting special forces pay, who's getting pilots pay, who's getting special duties pay, who are bomb disposal trained, who are, because each different trade has got a different pay group in there. That would be manna from heaven and allow the Chinese intelligence services to bring in more targeted messaging and more targeted attacks against individuals who are in these areas of responsibility. And that would be worrying. Even more worrying would be if this is not the Chinese, it's not a nation state attack, because nations will try and gather intelligence in other nations. Chinese are doing it to us. Seems as if they've been successful here. We do it to them as well. But if this was a criminal gang and that data was going to be published on the dark web, that would be even more serious for individuals and individual security.
We've also heard a lot about China trying to recruit spies in the West. Could they potentially use this information to blackmail people into becoming spies?
I don't think they use it to blackmail people to come into spies, but what it does is gives them the ability to target people better. So they'll be able to identify senior officers because if their rank is on there, so they can do that. They'll be able to identify people in specialist areas, so special forces, special duties personnel, and look at that. So it will be used in a way to try and enhance their intelligence gathering techniques. And I know this personally. I had an article, Fiona Hamilton from the Times did an article on me in 2021 on how the Chinese had tried to recruit me through social media, through LinkedIn. And that was identified as a formal approach by Chinese intelligence, and it would have led to me being compromised. The Chinese hadn't quite realized that I'd run counterintelligence operations across Northwest Europe for many years, so you got suspicious very quickly indeed, and put a few traps in place to see if this was an approach by Chinese intelligence, and they fell straight into the traps. So that made it certain in my mind, and I got the details to the appropriate authorities.
Just expand on that briefly, Philip. For those who aren't aware, what happened to you? How did they approach you?
Yeah, it was a legitimate business approach on LinkedIn by someone asking me to go and present a paper at a conference in China. Now, I present papers at conferences all the time across the world, and it was within the area that I work in. But it's whenever I started to get into the details of how they were going to pay me, what where I could get properly briefed and what they wanted, they were vague on that. When it came to payment, it was going to be in cash, and that was the first alarm bell that rang. So I got the individual I was talking to on the messaging app on LinkedIn. I got him to switch to a secure communications means that I know that the average Chinese person has not got access to. And he switched to that very quickly indeed. And that was the second big alarm bell going, okay, if you can do that, you have got the authority of the state behind you. And I then started to do some more inquiries and play with them a little bit. And he then said, oh, it would be even better if you could get us information that was not necessarily in the public domain. And I openly asked him, said, do you mean classified material? He said, oh, if you think that, and he was giving me a list of the requirements. And I played with him until I thought I can't get anything more out of there. I am 100% certain I know who I'm dealing with, and got it reported in. And the government agencies, it was then the CPNI, it's now the NPSA, the National Protective Security Authority, have produced a fantastic booklet called Think Before You Link. And it's on their website. It's there for anyone to download. And my story is merged in with a bit of poetic license with some other stories that there are in there. But it's a very serious and ongoing threat.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Philip. That's fascinating. Just to go back to this particular Chinese cyber attack, could they share the information with anyone? I mean, there is a fear, for example, that this information could end up in Russian hands, and how might that be used?
Well, we're seeing increasing cooperation between Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. There seems to be an alliance coming together. So, yes, they could supply it to the Russians, and the Russians would exploit it in a different way as well. If it's got that payslip details and special forces, the Russians would then look and see if there are any special forces that could be potentially advising people inside Ukraine. We almost certainly would have some in the embassy providing support in there, and identify those as individuals that could put them at a particular threat. So they'd identify people are working overseas in different embassies because of their rank and their overseas alliances and everything else. So if that level of detail is compromised, that is something that, again, would easily be exploited by the Russians, the Iranians, North Koreans, and other hostile intelligence services. So the immediate read of the breach is it's serious, but the implications aren't massive. However, it could be, depending on the level of detail of what they've got access to, it could be an awful lot more serious than we've heard so far.
The timing of this story coming to light is interesting because Xi Jinping has been in the West. He's been in France on a state visit with Emmanuel Macron, and he's warned against a new Cold War developing between the West and China. How should the West approach Beijing at the moment?
Ooh, no, that's a really difficult one. Xi Jinping doesn't want a Cold War because of the economic implications. The thing that drives China in everything is economics, economics, and economics. They want to gain economic advantage, which is why they get accused of stealing intellectual property. The designs of advanced systems, so that they don't have to pay billions of dollars to design it. They just take someone else's design and build it quicker and cheaper than the company that's previously designed it. They don't want an economic war where sanctions are going to start being put on China and Chinese companies, because that will affect them enormously and affect what Xi Jinping is trying to do. So he will play the diplomatic card, as he's doing, as much as he possibly can, to try and stop that from happening. That's his motivation. What can we do about it? It's very difficult. We're dealing with another member of the Security Council of the United Nations. We're dealing with the second largest economy in the globe, and one that's vying to be the largest economy in the globe. They have had many years developing influence across our different countries. I think the best thing that we can do at the moment is increase our awareness of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and make sure we have closed down the easy access that there is now for their organizations to get the stuff that we have worked hard for, we have paid for, and everything else, and try and bring our relationship with China onto a more even and fairer keel. They've got the advantage at the moment because they've penetrated so many of our systems, and we've let them do it.
Philip Ingram, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.